There's so much that we want to read, but often little enough time to actually do it. And so we are forced to make decisions about what books are actually worth reading and excite us the most. And some of that criteria can be quite superficial in nature. In this video, I'm going to go through a tag that I did in cooperation with the booktuber Prose and Petticoats, who covers a range of classical works and fantasy and is a writer herself and sometimes has videos on writing, in fact. We decided to do a tag called Counting the Days tag. And this tag is all about the books that we anticipate reading for all sorts of reasons, but because we haven't read it yet, those reasons are going to be outside probably the substance by itself. It's going to be on the basis of other factors. So we made a list of 8 questions, each question attached to a different standard of what makes us excited about a book. And each of these questions is going to be an opportunity to show a book that we're excited about. So after watching my video, be sure to watch Prose and Petticoats' video when you get a chance. She's also going to have a list of books that she's excited about within the criteria set by the questions. And if you want to take part in this Counting the Days tag, please do. It's open to every booktuber who would be possibly interested. And it's really just an excuse to recommend a wide range of books off of different superficial standards. The very first question is, what is a book that you're excited to read based on the cover by itself? Now, this is something that perhaps we don't all openly admit, but of course, covers of books and the design of books, just the aesthetic of the book, is a pleasure in and of itself. So often what we get when we become excited about a new book is we start to paint a picture of all the memories to come in association with that book, and those painted colors often derive from the colors of the design of the book itself. There's a kind of feeling that comes from looking at certain covers and just the texture of holding a book and the ways that a book is an object in the world, and that becomes the object in our memory on top of, or perhaps organizing, the abstraction of the meaning of the text itself. So one book that immediately comes to mind when I think about a cover causing me to be excited to read something is the book 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. And you can see here, this cover is distinctive in that it takes a painting and wraps it clean around the edges of the book. And this particular painting is Jupiter and Semele by Gustave Moreau. It is a painting that to me grabs attention just in the scratchy, dense, emotional heft of the faces, this feeling of spiritual overture and grandness of a civilization long gone and the kind of mythology of that civilization. It makes me wonder, what is it about this painting that made it fit the storyline of this book? And I don't know how the painting relates to the book, but I love seeing this on my shelf, just the number 2666 in red with this elaborate, detailed, oil on canvas looking painting. And it just implies such a deep history. It implies connection to mythology. It has this feeling of grandness before I even open the book. And from what I know about the book itself, it is grand in much the same way as the painting on the cover, in the sense that it follows multiple critics as they attempt to dissect this highly mysterious author named Archimboldi. And in the process of their attempts to analyze that author's work and perhaps discover more about that author, they end up jumping around the world. And from what I understand, there is this famous section of the book called the section on the crimes. There's this point in the story where it breaks from the overarching narrative and begins to focus in on multiple kidnappings and assaults and murders of women. And it's the mystery surrounding those crimes, the attempts to discern who is committing these crimes, but it's also a reminder of those who are often ignored and lost, those who are on the margins of society and then don't get the luxury of being sought after quick enough to save their lives. My expectation with 2666 is of a book that's going to be challenging, that's going to be literarily stylistic, that's going to be rough around the edges and raw in various ways, possibly quite brutal to read and gruesome. And I'm excited to read it, not just because of the cover, but the ways that the cover seems to illustrate or latch onto some of the rawness and complexity of the substance of the book itself, and that is 2666. And very briefly, there's another book whose cover grabs my attention, and that is Hopscotch, a novel by Julio Cortázar. And this book, as far as I understand, is one that follows a character attempting to find his former lover. And in that process of attempting to find her, he has to travel from place to place to place. But there's a point in this book, I believe about halfway through, where at the end of the chapter, you are pushed to go to another chapter in the book and skip around. Instead of reading the book linearly, you are non-linearly jumping around, hopscotching your way throughout the text. And it matches this sort of imagery of feet on square boxes leaping from place to place to place. And that becomes the extension of the book, where in the book you are leaping from place to place to place within the plot. And it makes this book, which is otherwise 600 or so pages or 550 pages, it makes it into a much bigger experience as you reread certain pages and you recontextualize the information that you believe that you already knew. And in that process of hopscotching around, you are making a kind of progress, but it is an inner mental one as opposed to merely a plotline oriented dotting forward in linear fashion. And that is Hopscotch, a novel by Julio Cortázar. Okay, the next question in this tag is, what is a book that I'm excited about because of its author? Well, the first one that comes to mind is an author with an actively distinctive style, unlike anyone else who I've read before, and that would be Joseph McElroy, and specifically the book Women and Men. And this is a particularly thick, difficult, experimental novel that, from what I understand, jumps between two characters at a distance from one another in the same apartment complex. And as far as I know, they may not ever actually meet each other, but it follows their two lives in a kind of stream of consciousness fashion that blends in and out of the interiority of multiple different characters and also zooms out into a kind of abstract, distant view of what their lives is about. And Joseph McElroy is known for these really strangely elongated and mixed up and syntactically unusual sentences, wherein he seems to take that stream of conscious style and devote himself to it almost to a confusing degree. There are sometimes segments of some of the other works that I've read by him. I read a short story collection of his called Night Souls and Other Stories. And that one, each story felt like I was entering in and out of multiple minds without much clear indication of whose mind I was in. And there is a constant feeling of focalization and impression, of really fixating on the degrees of perception that each person has and how much the bias of their perception shapes how they exist within the world and even what the world is to them. And a book like Women and Men seems like such an expansive version of that style of writing, where it's just constantly weaving in and out of minds and thought processes. It's playing with consciousness and how different ways of awareness in the world can be so different from mind to mind to mind. And it's that kind of layered construction, that confusing, meandering quality of prose that makes me deeply curious what it would be like to stay in a style like that for such an extensive period of time in a book like Women and Men. And it's one of those books that is kind of intimidating based on his writing style. It's not easy to read paragraph by paragraph the way that he writes his text. And so I'm curious to see if I can actually manage to get through the whole thing and comprehend a good deal of it, or if I'm going to reach the end point and just feel confuddled and lost. And so that is Women and Men by Joseph McElroy. Another book that intrigues me on the basis of its author is A Moment's Liberty by Virginia Woolf. And this is quite a different version of writing from her than I'm used to. I love Virginia Woolf's novels. I find her stream of consciousness style being so inviting and poetic and just purely emotionally engaged through and through. And so it makes me all the more curious to get to her diaries, to see her thoughts on day-to-day life, the ways in which so much of her writing seems so philosophical in its considerations. And it makes me curious about how she reflects on living in the world and dealing with other writers and the books that she's reading. And from what I understand, A Moment's Liberty is the abridgment of her extensive 5 volumes of diaries, and it was abridged by the editor of those 5 volumes, so someone deeply familiar with the work. And I was prompted to want to read the diaries of Virginia Woolf because of Brendan Booth Jones's video on Virginia Woolf, in which he describes how much she communicates her writing process and her thinking about her various works. And alongside A Moment's Liberty, I also got her a writer's diary, which was curated by her husband after she died. And both of those in tandem seem like a really great way to get deeper into the somewhat self-conscious mind of Virginia Woolf on top of her literature. She is quite possibly my favorite fiction writer. And so it just makes me all the more excited to get into the softer side of herself, the less pruned side of her writing, just her day-to-day experimentations, and perhaps some of the ways that self-consciously, even when we write a diary, we know that it might someday be read. And so there's a part of us that is still being constructed, an aspect of our identity that we're forming in the process of writing our diaries. And I wonder what Virginia's identity molding was like in the words of her diary entries. So that is why I'm curious about A Moment's Liberty and A Writer's Diary by Virginia Woolf. Now, what about a book that I'm excited about specifically because of the premise of its story? Well, the first book that came to my mind is one of the ones by the Oulipo writers. There was a group of writers that formed many years back called the Oulipo writers, and they strive to put constraints on their writing in order to discover some of the creativity that emerges when you're limited. So much of creativity is honed by limitation, and so they use that limitation in order to propel themselves forward into unexpected directions. And one of those writers, and one of the most famous, was Georges Perec. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I'm not sure. Pardon the pronunciation. But he has this book, Life, a User's Manual. His limitation that he placed upon himself in this book was to write about a single moment in time spanning an apartment complex where it's going in and out of every room within that apartment complex within this one moment in time. And in the process of doing so, we begin to discover the history of all the members of this apartment complex, but also the interconnected, interwoven nature of their lives, and perhaps some singular mystery at its core. And it's almost as if you yourself are going to be the detective making inferences about what occurred before the moment that you're witnessing, and you're going in and out of all of these details, and it's restricted in its plot line in the sense that it cannot be a typical story just told very directly from point A to B to C, but instead it's rather a story born of details, and it's a story constructed within your mind as a reader as you interconnect those details in a fashion of narrative. And it's perhaps revealing of the ways in which we can't help but avoid narrative out of details. We can't help but see a diorama array of facts and piece them together in some significant arc and relationship. And this book, Life, a User's Manual, seems to be Georges Perec's attempt to play with the interconnectedness of lives in one single building, but also the ways in which we want to make connections in our lives, in all of our lives. And that's why the premise of this book excites me. It sounds like a fantastic experiment to be restricted to one point in time, and then to have the reader need to do the work halfway through in order to discern what's really going on. And my expectation is I've read bits of Georges Perec's writings before. I've read parts of his book where he removed the letter E throughout the whole thing, and he had to write the entire book without the use of that common vowel. And what is most impressive about Perec's style, in spite of these limitations, is that he maintains beauty in his prose. You don't even notice the limitations as you read. So I'm really excited to see how he accomplishes that same feat of incredible dexterity in his writing in spite of such restraints in this book, Life, a User's Manual. Okay, now it's time to discuss a book that I'm excited about because of its style. Something about the way that it's written that makes me anticipate actually finally getting to it. This next book is going to be a popular one. You've almost certainly heard of it before. It's one of these grand efforts that we all probably imagine we'll get to at some point in our lives. And that is the multi-volume book novel series In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. Obviously, I've opened the first volume in the series and read the opening pages and paragraphs and felt the kind of elongated, meditative style of writing that Proust seems to capture, where he goes in and out of memory and association and maintains a consistent tone through and through from moment to moment. And there was a review fairly recently by Reed Red, who's a fantastic booktuber reviewing all sorts of contemporary and experimental novels, and he's so thoughtful with his analysis. But he recently did a review of the first book in this series. In my translation, it's called Swan's Way, and in his, it was something a little different. And he describes the writing style of Proust as being perhaps some of the best writing he's ever seen, he's ever come across. And it just makes me all the more curious to see what is so spectacular about someone like Marcel Proust. I know that my favorite author, Virginia Woolf, loved Marcel Proust's writing. So many modernist writers were inspired by what Proust was doing. And it's one of those books that I have to get to at some point in my life. I feel like I can barely call myself a serious reader if I don't finally get around to all of the books in this collection. And so, based on the style of writing, I think Marcel Proust In Search of Lost Time is one of those gifts that I'll have to open at some point in my life. And then the next question is, what is a book that you're excited to read because of its influence? And I think the next book has to be chosen for that. It is essential to understanding how narrative history is done, and that is The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. Gibbon wrote this extensive series of the decline of the Roman Empire, packed with his opinions and packed with a kind of divisive, critical, keen eye. It's interesting to me to try to go through this classic work of history, this really, really long work of history, to just try to grasp how did this change the form of history and how history could be done. And I'm sure there's plenty of things about this series of books that is potentially out of date, but his writing style is so dense and carefully done. I heard this story that he would write a lot of this standing up and just reciting to himself paragraph by paragraph, and he would continuously make edits in his speech over each paragraph until he finally got the flow of it perfectly. And so it's that sense of prosody within the text itself that really makes me curious about what it's like to actually read through this whole thing. And just like Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, it feels to me like The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is going to be one of those series of books that, though it will take an extensively long time to actually get through, it seems vital to understanding what has become of history writing. And then the next question is, what is a book that you're excited about because of its emotional weight? I had a hard time picking this one. I decided to pick 4 that kind of circle around a similar time in history, but also a similar pain. And that is going to be the Gulag Archipelago, the Holocaust, the Rape of Nanking, and I, You, We, Them. And of course, all the authors and titles will be in the description if you're interested. The first one is hugely famous. It's obviously written by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and it's his 3-volume journalistic attempt to dissect and yank out the various stories and sufferings of those who were within the Gulag prison system of the Soviet Union. And he had personal experience, having been there himself. And from what I understand, it's a very personal, angry, fierce diatribe about some of the mishandlings and cruelties of that Gulag system, the ways in which our psychology of attachment to group identities and attachment to political self-righteousness can sometimes lead to a great deal of tamping down the freedoms of others and destroying the lives of those we deem unworthy of our care and protection. In the Gulag Archipelago, he seems to dive into various stories of those surrounding him in the Gulag. And I know that there's some criticism of this book. There's all these biases levied against Solzhenitsyn. There's all these claims of inaccuracy. But it seems to me that there's probably various kernels of truth worth holding on to. And from the little bit that I've read, I know some people don't like the style of these books, but they seem to me perfectly flowing and extraordinary in its humanity and sympathy and care and the rage that emerges again and again throughout the text. There's this kind of feeling of like the anger that motivates a book like the Gulag Archipelago is a kind of anger I want to have a sense of. And whether I come out of it feeling just pushed away or disgusted, that's something that I can decide for myself. And so I'm excited to actually get to this 3-volume epic. And just like the other ones, I know it's going to be really long and it's going to take a huge chunk of my life, but it feels worthwhile to dive into, because the Gulag Archipelago is a huge work that is significant in terms of trying to place a lens upon the sufferings of so many who otherwise would have been lost. I'm excited to see this passionate attempt to capture that time in history and that place. And that is the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And then, of course, like I said, there's the Holocaust, a history of the Jews of Europe during the Second World War. Martin Gilbert is a historian who uses a lot of extensive quotes from people on the ground during history and weaves them in and out of his kind of narrative arc. The Holocaust, as far as I understand, is a book that tries to talk about the Holocaust from directly the experiences of the many victims during the Holocaust. And so this is a kind of book that's going to carry the emotional weight of dealing with people at the very bottom of a heavy boot of vicious and horrifying power that was consuming a whole nation during the time of World War II. And it intrigues me to just hear the variety of those voices as collected by Martin Gilbert. And so I know it's going to be difficult to get through, but I also know it's going to be intensely important to actually get through it. And so that's why I want to check out The Holocaust by Martin Gilbert. And then another one that's going to be similarly painful is The Rape of Nanking. And this is about when Japan invaded China directly prior to the official start of World War II, although I think some people consider it the start of World War II. From what I understand, they completely decimated a whole city in China and tortured and maimed and assaulted, and just the layers of cruelty is extensive in terms of what they had done. And so this book is this journalistic effort to comprehend and communicate the vast array of horrors done during this, what is described as the rape of Nanking, done by the Japanese army, a thing that was not known about for a long time, as far as I understand. And I believe this book popularized the event in the consciousness of Americans, at the least. I'm curious to see what the details actually are. I know that it's going to, again, be extremely painful, but I think it's necessary to hear about the pains of others just so that perhaps it can grant some perspective, perhaps help you appreciate what has come before, so that you don't take so many things for granted. I think it's easy to take your own life and how easy it is for granted. I look forward to reading this book, even though, again, it's going to be extremely emotionally difficult. Speaking of emotional difficulty, there is this author, Dan Gretton, who wrote this book, I, You, We, Them. And this is his attempt to capture the history of what I believe he calls the desktop killers. These are people who lead to mass genocide of whole large swaths of people. And because it is done at a distance, there is also an emotional distance that occurs, and it makes it easier to destroy millions of lives when it feels like it's just merely a stroke of the pen. He researches many different examples of the distancing between I and you and we and them, this notion of tribalism and separation, and some of the psychological excuses that allow so much harm to occur when it's done outside of the bubble of your empathy. And so that is the book I, You, We, Them by Dan Gretton. And next we have a book that I'm excited to read based on its humor. Now, I don't usually pick books to read based on humor. I don't know that I've read a lot of funny books. I'm pretty sure I've never laughed out loud from a book. But there's one book that came out not too long ago that, from what I hear, is one of the few books that is actually funny enough to make you laugh while reading. So I'm curious if that is really the case. And that is Ant Kind by Charlie Kaufman. And that name, Charlie Kaufman, should be familiar. He is the writer-director of Synecdoche, New York, and he wrote various other experimental, strange, sometimes funny, often quite dark and depressing films. I like Charlie Kaufman's films. I like a lot of the effort that he places into them, even though there's a kind of single note that repeats throughout his films, a kind of depressive, dark, sad note. I think he deals with it in ways that are intriguing, and the kind of avant-garde leaning style that he employs is always worthwhile in his films. The book Antkind is the first novel that he wrote. It follows a film critic who apparently sees a film that is so incredible to him. It's like the most perfect film ever, but I guess the film gets destroyed somehow, and then he's trying to remember the details of that film, and I don't know what happens after that. It reminds me very much of the premise of Infinite Jest, because that obviously circled around a film that was so great that it was a form of entertainment that they couldn't resist. It sounds very similar to what Antkind is about, although it doesn't sound like the film is addictive. It just sounds like it is purely great, and this critic feels a pressure to be able to recreate it or communicate it to the outside world. That is Antkind by Charlie Kaufman. I'll get back to you if it's actually funny as people claim that it is, but I hope it also has some of the layers of more uncomfortable emotion that his films are known for. I hope it's not just funny. I haven't heard a lot about this Antkind book being thoughtful or particularly psychologically complex, but I guess we'll see. But in the meantime, this is the book that I'm looking forward to for its humor above all. The last book that I'm excited for is one that I'm excited for based on its challenge or difficulty. And that's going to be this recent purchase of mine. This is The School for Atheists by Arno Smit. Now, I'll have to show some footage of this, but the thing that's distinctive about Arno Smit is his highly unusual grammar and the ways in which he uses punctuation to attempt to capture the various disruptions of thought, also attempts to link together parts of words in order to make you think about some of the etymology behind the words, or to accomplish various puns in the sounds of words so that we get multiple stacks of meaning in each sentence. Arno Smit, I've read his collected novellas. I have a few other of his books. He is known for being a very, 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 very dense writer, but there's also some extraordinary connections in imagery that he makes. There's moments in some of his collected novellas that I just find absolutely pure poetry in the prose, in terms of the line-by-line structure and symbolism that he employs, and the ways that he uses the sound of language to really carry forward so much of his choices. This particular book, The School of Atheists, is supposed to be some final draft kind of attempt of his. He had done this massive, massive book, Bottom's Dream, which was like over 1,000 pages, multiple columns of text packed with detail and references specifically to Edgar Allan Poe. And then he released another book called Evening Edged in Gold, which is an additional continuation of this really elaborate stream of conscious movement through detail after detail after detail, almost inundating you with details. And this book, as far as I know, is like this last collection of his attempt to capture so much of the note-taking that he had been doing in his life, the ways that he was jotting down constant ideas and play on words. And it's the playfulness with language that makes me most curious about this, but it's also specifically the challenge that intrigues me when it comes to Arno Smit. It's just an opportunity for me to stretch my readerly muscle to really have to puzzle my way through a lot of the text. And even though the book itself is packed with words on every page, it's like a wall of text, page after page after page. Each individual page is probably going to take a very long time to get through, not just because of the amount of text, but just because of the amount of work that it takes to discern the meaning of the text. This is one of the few books of his. Most of his books are like $1,000 in order to purchase. This is one of the few that you could get for a reasonable price. So therefore, I'm looking forward to this particularly challenging text to be one of the, not the most immediate next Arno Smit read, but one of the ones that I read fairly soon. So that is The School for Atheists by Arno Smit. So those are the books that I'm counting the days for, based on the name of the tag. Please remember to watch Prose and Petticoats attempt at this tag. And if you're a booktuber who's excited to talk about some of the books that you haven't read yet, please do this tag yourself. I look forward to watching all of your recommendations as well. I hope this was a good range of selections so that you maybe have discovered something for yourself to read. This has been the Counting the Days tag, and thanks for watching.